Welcome to Report on Science Fiction. We'll be looking at the book called Hard to Be a God. It's a science fiction book because, well, the way the plot takes place, there's a future Earth and exists with advanced technology, so it makes it a kind of a science fiction book, but most of the plot still occurs during the medieval period, so it's more feels like a fantasy, but I guess because we have a future Earth, might as well make it a science fiction then. It's a Soviet novel written in 1964, and it's written by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. They are famous Soviet fantasy and science fiction writers, and when people talk about them, they usually refer to this work as an example of what they're actually able to do, what they're able to write. And the book is also very popular, just outside of the former Soviet Union as well. I read it in the original Russian, and so keep that in mind when I'm going to be commenting on the book. There could be some maybe differences due to translations or so on, but generally a very good translation should not impact the plot or the narrative in any way. So therefore, again, most things should hold similar or same. But when it comes to my comments about the book, but maybe there might be some changes, might be some difference in experience if you read it in translation. So let's jump into exactly what the book is about. And I already mentioned that the plot focuses on the planet that's going through a period of late Middle Ages, but what happens to make this a science fiction is that we have historians from the future Earth that are living on this planet as well, and they're living among the humans that populate this planet, and they have integrated themselves into the societies of different nations, and they pretty much here to observe and learn and look how the world is being kind of evolving, or people are kind of going through around in their daily lives, and historians are observing all these processes because the book takes pains to point out that all these processes are similar or same as what Earth went through during its Middle Ages. So therefore, it's kind of a practical case for the historians here to look at things. But in the end, historians are not only just observing, they do kind of interfere or influence the world around them, because they try to push it kind of along the lines of how it's supposed to develop. But they do so not in a major ways. It's in more minor ways, such as they might help out some thinker or some person that they believe is it would be essential to move the society forward, or they just might help some destitute people because they feel that they should help them so that they stay alive, or they might push some other person towards some kind of idea or so on. So this kind of situations do occur, and the historians are trying kind of interfering, but they're not really pushing the society completely along. That seems to be journey is discouraged, and the plot goes through the idea that, well, why it's to be discouraged and so on, because it kind of gives examples of so on of attempts to do kind of more of a direct interference. So let's talk about the story. The story, well, itself, it has a prologue and ends with an epilogue. So the prologue and epilogue are connected, and if the writers are putting this in, there must be a reason for it, and I believe there's a reason for it, because I think these two things actually rescue the whole novel for me. Otherwise, because when I'm just reading through it, to me it was just like a regular narrative I would find in any science fiction or fantasy book, and to me it was like, okay, yes, yeah, I got it, and it's like, but to me it was like, so what's so special? And only when the book ends and the epilogue does a reference back to the prologue, and then it kind of reflects on all everything that happened in the story, does it tie in to me and say, well, okay, I get this. There is an attempt to kind of be more philosophical about what's going on in the actual plot. Now, the plot itself focuses on adventures of a character called Rumata, who is one of the future historians. And pretty much it's a short period, a few days, well, not few days, I think several days that occur, that happen, and the events are happening, and Rumata, this person, is observing them and participating in one way or another in these events. So generally, if you just read that without the prologue and the epilogue, again, like I said, the narrative would be just like a normal, regular narrative, nothing special. Now, what really, again, set the story for me at first for failure in terms of for my enjoyment was the fact that it was just full of tropes and assumptions about medieval society, and just also tropes that you would see in generally science fiction or fantasy novels that are not that great usually. And well, first trope about medieval society, we have a besides one of them that was always talking about them not washing, like all people are dirty there, and the idea that, well, why wash and so on. That's not exactly true. It's kind of been always assumed that during Middle Ages people did not wash themselves for some reason. That was an assumption, but that, as far as I know, historians are not actually supporting. Will not get behind that idea. It seems to be more held among the people who are not historians, who think back to Middle Ages, that people are not washing. During Middle Ages, people were pretty clean. Actually, a certain number of Roman bathhouses, even in what period is called Dark Ages, were still operating, and they were being used, and so on and further on. It's just that maybe they went away from that whole giant bathhouse washing, where they all were going into the bathhouses together, to more of a private washing situations. But they still did clean themselves, and they tried to keep clean. So here the novel actually talks about how people are not clean and so on, and all this kind of problems. Yeah, that was kind of there. We have also another trope: an overpowered main character. This character is just overpowered on basic everything. He's able to think better than everybody else. Well, okay, you can kind of say it, well, yeah, he's from future Earth, so he has some kind of advanced knowledge and so on. But yeah, it means all that he has is advanced knowledge. It doesn't mean that he's gonna be somehow wiser than everybody else around him, or at least that or that he's gonna be able to know everything way better than everybody else around him either. So it does not feel right. But it actually comes off even worse from the fact that the main character here is not only overpowered in terms of mental abilities and so on, he's overpowered physically. We have a quite often the descriptions that he seems to be able to take on people, take on the enemies here much better. It's referenced that he knows secret martial arts techniques that have not been developed yet, and so on and so on and so on. And to me, just knowing from the fact that we have modern martial arts that exist in the current situation. We also know that all the modern martial arts are actually a derivative of much older martial arts that go back sometimes quite far back in the Middle Ages, period of Middle Ages, or the ancient times sometimes. So to say that somehow the modern martial arts are better or they have more stuff in them than the previous ones would be wrong, because they quite often are derivative. The human body moves only in certain ways. Biomechanics have not changed, the pressure points have not changed, the actual layout of human body hasn't changed. So therefore, the martial arts that were developed through the historical period, and they would have been they did exist in medieval societies, because these people handled weapons, they fought and so on, they would know how to fight and handle weapons, means that these people would be quite effective as a martial artist. So to say that somehow a person coming in from the future would be better, it's very difficult to say that, especially given the fact that the person from the future would not be practicing lethality of the martial arts as a person would be during the Middle Ages, because the people in the Middle Ages, especially if they're soldiers, they're trained to kill, while the modern martial arts actually have a lot of lethality taken out of them in order to ensure that it's turned more into a sport, so that when the competitions occur, we don't have people being brought out on stretchers out of the competition all the time. So therefore, I wouldn't put the idea that somehow a person from the future would be a better martial artist or know something better than the characters than the people living during the Middle Ages. So he might be on the equal footing, but not there, right? If he had somehow augmented abilities due to some kind of technology, that's fine. But there was no mention of that. There was a mention that he is able to withstand some hits and so on because he wears better armor. Maybe that's okay, fine. It's kind of we can dance around that part. But the idea that he somehow knows better move or something like that just does. I just didn't like that, and that doesn't fly with people, especially who studied the Middle Ages. They know that the war we as a modern society actually know that there's a fencing and martial arts manuals available from Middle Ages Europe. So yeah, all right. So and then we also have the overpowered other characters that are in the book that overpowered again. These are characters that for some reason able to rip out chains out of solid walls and can scream so that the doors shake and so on. This kind of over exaggeration is present, and it's annoying. It's annoying when you're reading this book because it's kind of like, well, yeah. It's like am I reading a more of a deeper philosophical book, or is this more of something that to be meant to be entertainment, light entertainment? Yeah, that takes away from it, from the story itself. So other issues that we can talk further on the whole tropes and stuff and problems that this historical section here. Gold currency. The historians actually manufacture their own gold currency from other elements, and they do so to finance your life in this society. Except the problem is that eventually it's also pointed out that they actually make a very pure gold coins. Well, if you are a historian of Middle Ages, you would know that coins were not that kind of, were not at high purity. They had a certain amount of gold or silver in them, and the fraction of that was actually varied depending on which country it was, and so that's how the foreign exchange worked back in the day. So the idea that suddenly the idea hits the historians like, oh wait, we've been doing this whole purity wrong. It's like, well, you guys are historians, supposed to be experts at this. Why are you getting this wrong? So anyway, then the weapon effectiveness. I talked about the idea that the character is overpowered, so his weapons he's able to slice through a whole bunch of stuff, so on, and that's kind of appears all that. Fine, maybe his weapons are manufactured advanced technology, maybe somehow that kind of helps, I'm not sure, but how that will help, there's not much explanation. But same way, he's able to take on more damage because he wears armor and so on, that's also better manufactured, but there's no really explanation why it would not pass along some other force from being hit. So the idea is that, yeah, you might have armor, so just take a helmet, put it on your head, and then have somebody ask somebody to just hit you with a sword. Yes, the helmet will block the sword strike, but you're still gonna feel the ringing in your ears from a hit, and that seems to be not occurring. Like there's no kind of a transference of force of a hit itself onto the physical body. But again, this kind of thing was bothering me when I was reading it. But then maybe the future text explains all, even though there's no explanation given. That's fine. And then of course we have the idea that medieval people are just primitive, they're brutish, they seem to be unable to understand some concepts and so on. And that also flies in the face of the idea that we did have a bunch of medieval philosophers and so on in the medieval Europe and the medieval world overall. So how does this work, right? And why I'm always saying medieval Europe, because the book does kind of point to this to be more of like a situation where it's this is a late medieval period, and in the countries that historians are inhabiting, that that the reference seems to be something closer to the Holy Roman Empire situation. So it is more of a European type of situation there, but generally, again, the idea is that, well, people are discarded because like some of statements of how people act. It's like, oh well, they're acting this way because they're undeveloped, they are kind of a medieval in the way of thinking, and so they are not very well developed. But we do know that people had some amount of development that occurred during Middle Ages into the philosophical and so on. So these people, there should be, to kind of discount them just saying, yeah, because they're primitives and we are so much better. Well, I don't know. Again, it would have been better if the actions would have been explained by the thinking and philosophies of that period that they are basing them on, rather than just saying, oh, they just kind of primitive savages and so on. That I didn't, again, was not something that I liked in the actual story. But let's get into the themes. So this would be where the book is rescued, like the narrative is rescued by the themes that it kind of tells us. So the first and the main theme is, I believe, is here is influence on that people coming from way more future developed like society, as we're talking here, future developed, that has all this new technology, all this development, who has seen all this process kind of play out, and how would they go about influencing the medieval world situation, right? A society that is not as developed in terms technologically and so on. So it's kind of sitting at a lower economical development. Also, there is much lower, and technological development. So in a way, people, these future historians, are pretty much gods, because they have so much knowledge available to them, they have technology available to them, that they are kind of like gods walking among these people, and that's why the book is called It's Hard to Be a God. So the question becomes is that how do you kind of interfere here? How do you influence the society? Direct, rapid kind of a progress attempts are discouraged, because it's shown that, well, the locals, the medieval people here will not accept this kind of rapid progress, especially as it's shown that they kind of, either because they're just brutish and undeveloped and unenlightened and so on, or there's also a bit more of a kind of reference to the fact that they just might not accept the understanding of the ideas that the person from the future is trying to push on them, their own morals and ideals, which will be contradictory to the morals and ideals of the medieval society. Now, that's kind of handled in the very beginning of the novel, but then later on in the novel, there's actually a whole discussion, again, back to the whole idea of how this kind of influence, how this kind of interaction should be happening. And the interaction happens between one of the historians and another person, it's kind of done as more of a philosophical discussion. And so the person from medieval period says, well, then if somebody is like that kind of a god person development, well, why doesn't that person then give everybody who's repressed in this time period a freedom, and they satisfy all the basic needs of people, so that kind of it uplifts the society this way? And then the response is that, well, that's not going to work, because the strong will take from the weak. If you try to give out all this stuff to everybody, the strong will still take from the weak, and then the weak will be still left destitute. So it doesn't solve the situation of unevenness in social economic terms, or the fact that some people will be oppressed versus not oppressed, right? So then we have also then the person from medieval society go effectless. Then, well, in that case, shouldn't this godly being take away the capability of the strong to do violence on the weak, so that this way they cannot take away from the weak what was given to them? And the response is that, well, yes, you can do that, but then it's just because you take away the ability to do violence from a group that is currently strong does not mean that that's how it's going to remain. What will happen is that a new group that's able to take to commit violence will take over and be the new strong group. So if we go back to the whole cycle, it's still you're going to have a strong taking away from the weak. Then the medieval person says, well, why don't you just punish all those people who use violence? Like, you just go ahead, because you, as a god, you should have ability to punish. And then, of course, the response is that, well, all humans are born weak, and they eventually become strong through the acquisition of some kind of power and some kind of ability to do things, to influence around them. And this is it's quite often proposed through one way, through violence, or another, because they start to use that power on other people. So if we start taking away, just punishing all these people who use whatever power against others, we slowly will have to punish everybody, because as you punish one person, the other person starts to do something, you punish another person. So it's kind of becomes a runaway problem that you just, again, go back to the whole idea previous, that if you take away somebody else's, one person's to do violence, the another person will step in. Type of situation here is being discussed. And then finally, then the medieval person says, why don't you then provide so much that there's no more needs, that not only the needs of people are satisfied, but their wants as well, and so therefore nobody feels that they have to go and take from somebody else. It makes no point. There's so much goods and services are being provided, that there's no need for that. And of course the response is that to that as well, yeah, it's kind of like utopia type of idea here, but then people will become passive because they don't need to do anything to achieve anything, because it's already everything's provided, and they become 100% reliant on the God to continue to provide to them. So the medieval person says, well, why don't you then provide slowly, kind of build up to that whole abundancy and so on? And the response is that, well, if you slow down the whole thing, well, how's that any different from what happens naturally? Eventually people will learn to provide for themselves whatever needs and wants they have. They'll just keep on progressing through the historical, development as they're supposed to, and they'll get to that the same eventual development in the end. So if you slow down to such an extent that it's not causing any kind of problems, it's as if not. It's similar to us doing nothing at all. So the medieval person says, well, then fine, let's turn people's thinking towards work and study. Let's force them to just to think about work and study away from kind of violent and so on and other thoughts. And this is a kind of reference to the idea of a mass hypnosis and some kind of influence and so on. And of course, this is the counter to this is that, well, that takes away the free will of the people. So that's not right either. And finally, the medieval person gives up and says, well, then the God's supposed to should just leave us alone, because there seems to be nothing the godly person can do for us that without causing some kind of additional effects or issues or problems. And of course, there's counter to that is that the God cannot leave people alone, because he feels bad about the fact how people are living, what kind of situations they are, and so on. And the reason I liked this whole exchange as they went through it was that it's kind of talks about this, not only the ideas that, well, somebody from the future interfering in the medieval period. It's actually could be perceived as a kind of dilemma that people have. How does a more economically advanced nations should be helping out less economically advanced nations, right? What do you do? How do you go in? How do you influence? Because all the arguments that are being go through the discussion in a way apply. So all that logic still applies. And so it leaves that kind of thinking, and the author does not kind of resolve the situation. It doesn't say which one is it that actually will be the final, what's the final solution. They go through, well, this, you can do that, but then this is a problem. You can try this, but then there's this a problem, and so on. And they keep going back and forward. Finally, there's there's a further discussions about this that happen. Specifically, there's also discussion the idea of what about if the future historians provide very advanced weaponry to rebels so they can overthrow the oppressors and so on. And the response to that is the promise that, well, if this future weaponry is provided, yes, they'll be able to overthrow the oppressors, but then they themselves become the new rulers, the rebels, and they'll create the new aristocratic class, and they'll enforce their view of how society should be through using this new advanced weapons. And so they'll be the new oppressors in the end. So the idea is that if you give that kind of power, the idea that power will corrupt them and so on, well, this is kind of one way that is explained here. But in the end, it also talks about the idea, well, this is also change, but it's pointed out that actually that the support that in this case the future historians are not giving direct military support into the weapons, but he seems to be providing some kind of monetary assistance and so on, and indirect support, which creates in itself an influence to how the rebels are fighting. They no longer go in as this is our only chance and so on. They actually consider the fact that, well, maybe if this does not work out, we still have a ability to fall back. We have additional funding that will be provided and so on. That there will be support. We'll be able to kind of be spirited away, helped out and so on, because there are people who try to help us, who are immune to kind of to situations that we are not immune to. So this is kind of again future the discussion there. And finally, there's also talk about the idea that well, when you think about, yes, if you look back in hindsight, you can always tell how and what action should have been taken to influence for better outcome, but that only seems to be possible to do so while you're looking back in the hindsight, not while these actions are happening. So this is, I would say, one of the biggest themes of this novel that's explored. Sadly, it's it kind of goes this whole exploration of this whole discussion occurs more close to the end of the novel rather than throughout all of it equally. It's more backloaded, so you have to get through through most of the other text first before you get to this. Now, other themes here are psychological and emotional burden that occurs for the people who are outsiders in this society. So in the medieval society, they come from the future society, which has different ethics and moral codes, and so they're living through looking at this, and it's really this struggling inside to what they're seeing in this society, which might be acceptable or considered to be fine, because the moral codes and the ethics codes of the two different groups are clashing. But they're not openly clashing. They're kind of clashing inside the brain, inside the thinking of the historians, who kind of have to live with the idea that, well, we cannot really do anything about this because this is not how the locals perceive these actions, and but we want to get the locals to stop certain actions because we believe that they are doing this wrong, but so on. So this kind of the burden that these people have and it carries to them and how it influences them overall is a bit discussed here in the theme. It's, I would say, one of the better themes here. One of the more open themes, in which is usually I see discussed when the people talk about this book, is the idea that how repressions overall impact the nations, the idea that they destroy the intelligentsia class and so on. This is very openly stated in the book. There's no two ways around. There's no discussions here, just kind of openly shown, and there's tons of reference to make it to ensure that everybody understands that the references to the Nazi Germany as well. So no subtlety any kind, I would say here. But I think the subtlety lies here is the fact that the others are also pointing out that this doesn't have to be talking about the repressions that were done by the Nazi Germany only. There's any other repressions pretty much do the same thing. So they do kind of hint at that more, but this is usually what most of these discussions I've seen online when the people talk about these books. I prefer, like I said before, the theme of influencing the development of society as a better one, because that one actually leaves a lot of things to be kind of fought over. Here it's straightforward when it comes to repressions. Then there's also a theme of the rebellions, the factionalism inside of them, the fact that as the rebellions begin to succeed, the different factions that were united by the common goal against one enemy now begin to break up apart or start fighting each other, and so on. Therefore, many rebellions fail in their finally trying to kind of overcome the oppressors and so on. This kind of thing occurs. And it's explained that this is happening and so on, and it's referenced here as one of the, I would say, minor themes in this book. And finally, let's talk about the prologue and epilogue. So, as I mentioned, this is what actually rescues the narrative. It falls back again to kind of into the influence theme, but it also talks about a few other things. So this is not much of a spoiler. I will talk about what happens in the prologue. We have a group of young kids. Well, maybe they're not already kids, maybe they're a bit older, but they going through the forest, they're playing in the forest. They come across an old road which is one-way road, because they see signage that says this is one way. So it's a kind of, so the traffic should be flowing in one direction on this road, and one of them decides to. They see what looks like to be tracks of a car that left, that came out from that road and went on further, and so one of them decides to follow the tracks in the direction what would have been the proper direction of traffic and go there, and the other person decides to go in opposite direction to the traffic and go in the opposite direction. The person who follows the tracks of the car claims to found the car, the driver, and the car was broken down, and he helped the driver and so on. Of course, this is all pretend because these kids are playing, so they kind of making up the stories of what they're seeing. And so the other person goes back and he claims that he found a blown up bridge and a skeleton that chained to a machine gun. And so then after all the events in the book, we come back to epilogue, and this is reference again in the epilogue. The people reference to this whole what happened in the prologue with the question. The idea is that, well, what does this all kind of might have a meaning to it, and the idea that maybe the roads like flow of history, and then therefore what's your decisions and how do you decide to go along here. And it comes back to the idea of what do you do, how do you influence. Do you go and just help people along to move along the traffic, and that's what one did, or do you try to go back in history and to try to fight kind of battles, to go back and regress in a way, because that's kind of also hinted the idea that you go back, but then the others say, what do you find? Well, you find a broken bridge, so that means you cannot go all the way back, and you find a skeleton, which is kind of maybe a reference to death, so you will find death there. You're not going to find any further progress. One person who went along the flow of history and kept on advancing kind of goes and helps out, and so people keep on moving, while the other person went backwards and in terms of development, and went to more primitive type of a situation, as the book kind of points usually to when it talks about the medieval society and so on, and therefore it found that they can't go back, and there's only death there. So this is a kind of, I think, one of the most interesting things. It's not 100% clear exactly what is meant. It's left to the interpretation. This was my interpretation of what it is, that you going back to fight old enemies in the past is not useful. You should need to be constantly moving forward into the future. That was what I saw as my interpretation. I'm not sure how other people would interpret it. If when you read the book, you see how do you think you interpret it. It's up to you, and see what do you think, but is the meaning behind all this. But the fact that the prologue and epilogue are included means that this idea is something that the authors really want to get across. Interestingly, I don't find it to be very much discussed online when I was looking what people were not really discussing this theme at all. Now, let's talk about the characters. We talked a lot about the themes, and I would say that's where the book shines, right? Like I said, the characters, well, there's only one character worth discussing, because there's only one character that actually is really developed throughout the book. It's the character of Rumata. He is the main character. He is a character of a historian who's living through in this. He's a future Earth person coming from future Earth, but living in this Middle Ages period. And I'm not sure even to say if he's really developed of a character as a character. He's more of a, because he goes through the whole internal struggle with this whole idea that he lives in this world. He feels that it's unfair to people. It feels that people acting not in the right way and so on. He has all these moral dilemmas, and he keeps on having them. There's no kind of resolution to it in a way. So I'm not sure if there was any actual development, but yeah, this just back in that kind of discussion kind of creates it points out his internal conflict, and it's how it causes his actions in this world. But I don't think the character actually comes out any way better or more knowledgeable at the end of the novel itself. I think if anything, it's just the novel again communicates more through its narrative itself and the plot and all these themes that I was discussing, to let the reader to come out with a bit more of a philosophical thinking about the situation, rather than have the character kind of move along in development. So let's move away from all that. Let's go get into literary style, which is, I think, is very important if you want to read the books. That I prefer the books to be easy to read, easy to pick up, easy to remember what's happening in the plot, not too much complexity layered in, so that if you have to stop and you have to open up the book a few days later, you're not lost again. You can remember what was happening. So this is the third-person limited narrative from the point of view of the main character. So anything that happens outside of that character's point of view, we don't know. So therefore, everything is interpreted from that person's kind of what he sees and how he sees things. So that might be giving us a stamp of how he sees the world around him. But then if he's a historian, we're going to come back to the idea of how he perceives the medieval world. He's a historian of medieval period. He should also know that you're supposed to judge people of that period by the morals and codes of that period. As that's what historians do. You don't project your morals, ethics, and so on backwards in time. Yeah, we can say that, well, this is horrible, but you cannot really, like, sometimes looking at what was happening in certain events, we say, yeah, that's according to our moral standard, that this is horrible, but this is how the people perceive things and how they learn new things and how they were kind of live with that, because that was your moral and ethics situation at the time. So in this case, if this person is constantly judging people around him based on the moral code of what is his the development that comes from let's say, from that future Earth, basically. Overall, the book is very well written. It's easy to read. The narrative flows. The book is not too long. It doesn't outstay its welcome, especially given the fact that it seems to be backloaded. So that usually has, when you don't have enough of a theme spread out through the book, it usually has a situation that it causes a situation where sometimes you feel that the book's just moving too slowly along. Here, that's not the case. It's pacing, everything is very good. So overall, in conclusion, I would say it's a great book, and it's a great book due to those philosophical discussions in it, like the discussion specifically. Again, I'm going to mention the influence of how do you influence how do you influence a less advanced society that's less advanced technologically, less advanced economically, from if you are a more advanced technologically and economically society. How do you pass on, how do you influence the other society? How does this work? What kind of problems and issues are going to be there? The kind of philosophical discussion is great, and that's what rescues this book for me, including that the whole epilogue and the prologue situation there also adds to it. Of course, the issues with the portrayal of medieval society, the historical issues, of course, really take away from the book. Otherwise, I would have pushed it even further along. In terms of, I would have said it's I wouldn't say it's just a great book. I would have rated it better. And of course, the overpowered characters are not helping either. So it's kind of like they do cause some problems to immersion when you're reading, because, like, am I reading a more philosophical discussion here, or am I reading here what seems to be a power fantasy type of situation? So that's what I have to say about this book. If you like this video, please like it, and if you didn't like it, don't like it, then please follow and subscribe.